All right, we're going to be talking about Bionicle. We're going to be playing Minecraft just to have something going on while the video is going on. Also, I apologize if there are any sort of audio issues with OBS. Blame OBS, blame Windows. I cannot save my OBS settings. Just, it's not a thing I'm able to do anymore for some reason, and it's very, very obnoxious. Anyway, without further ado though, let's go ahead and talk about Bionicle Generation 2 and why I ultimately think it failed for more reasons than lack of advertising. I will admit, lack of advertising definitely hurt the series, but as somebody who followed the theme's reintroduction in 2015 without having any previous knowledge of it coming back while in school in a place where I had no internet access, just no internet access. It was non-existent where I was, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by people who were not aware of Bionicle, or for that matter, aware of my interest in Bionicle, right? So for all intents and purposes, I should not have found out about this wave of figures coming out until I got home, right? But I did come home back in 2014 from school, finally done with all of that, and yeah, lo and behold, I was like, all right, I'm waiting. I'm going to get some of these sets when they come out. I got a job. I bought actually a few Invasion from Below sets while I was waiting, which were phenomenal. My favorite wave from Hero Factory, but that's a separate story. Ultimately, I went out of my way and I saw these sets. I kept up with them. I thought, man, these look wonderful. Not perfect. I knew right away, yeah, they're using CCBS. It's not my favorite system, but I can accept that we exist in a different time where Bionicle exists in a different form, and I'm just happy to have these characters back and have pieces that ultimately I enjoy. And I did enjoy what I saw, what we got. To start off, all Bionicle 2015, the first wave, the master wave, needed to do was hit a home run, and boy did it. I think that it did a wonderful job. It was not perfect. I have critiqued many things about Bionicle 2015. The choice of having 3 sets at the $20 price point was bad, honestly. Lord of Skull Spiders, kind of bad. I think I can appreciate the idea, but the execution, not so much. The reason for its existence, not so much. Ultimately, though, 2015's Master Wave was followed up by the Skull Villain Wave. And while I am a fan of this wave ultimately, I will admit that it is a downgrade from the wave that came out prior. It's less colorful, even though, yes, it still has color in it. It is less focused on colors because it's more focused on metallics and it's more focused on transparent specifically, which is not a bad thing in and of itself, by the way. I think it's actually one thing that helps these villains stand apart from any other villain that had come out in Bionicle up until this point. Also, you know, the fact that they were skull type characters, right? Something we'd never seen before and something I appreciated. But being that Bionicle's first wave here was so colorful and these skull villains were not, the skull villains never really did anything that was that impressive with their builds either. The only build that really went out of the box was, unfortunately, the Skull Scorpio set, and it didn't go out of the box for the better. Right? That's probably the most universally disliked set from the wave, and arguably even from all of Bionicle G2, but your opinions may vary on that. Ultimately, okay, 2015 Wave 2 didn't knock it out of the park in the way that Wave 1 did, but this is not the first time something like this has happened. I mean, I lived through the Borak Cal, for example, and while the Borak are incredibly strong sets in the form of villains, in the form of builds, in the form of a lot of things that they did as the first true, adversaries to Bionicle's Toamata sets, they did everything they needed to do. The Borak Cal just copied it. So it's not that the Borak Cal were bad, it's the Borak Cal were boring. They'd done what we had seen before and didn't shake things up. But it's easier to forgive the Borak Cal because what followed them was the Roxy, something which kind of shook Bionicle to its core in a lot of ways, and even sort of redefined what Bionicle was. These were the first sets to also kind of have budget incorporated into their design, although in this case doing so by having several pieces shared between them, multiple dark gray pieces specifically. But ultimately, they changed up articulation, giving characters bendable joints, right? Bendable, even the movable head. For the first time ever in a Bionicle set, at least in a canister set, we had seen a character with movable heads, with movable legs, with arms with decent posability, a function that was new and novel and was capable of knocking masks off, etc. the Skull villains didn't do anything to address these problems, right? And, that's fair. To a degree, how much more articulation can you give a Bionicle in 2015? I guess you could make the waist bend, but then does that really add to him at that point? Does it kind of undermine this mass game that we were, working on reintroducing in this theme? Although ultimately it's undermined for other reasons. I've talked about that in a previous video as well. You can watch that. That said, taking all of this into account, we hit our budget wave. It wasn't perfect, but 2016 is a new year, and maybe Bionicle hits it out of the park again, but it just didn't. The Uniter sets, again, didn't really do anything that was novel comparatively to their Toa Master sets before them. And in fact, in a lot of ways, I think they were a bit regressive. It's not to say that they were bad, because again, that's more of a subjective thing, right? But ultimately, these sets also relied fairly heavily on metallic colors, for one thing, something that I think kind of plagued the Skull villain wave, but I could have at least gotten behind with those villains because they're villains. They're not heroes. They could have a different color scheme, and I think that's actually kind of a cool idea that Bionicle hadn't really ever explored before. But the Uniters, with their sort of crystalline textures, with their admittedly, new builds and even more custom builds, somehow came out of this year looking even more similar to each other than the Toa Masters from the year before, which is wild because the Masters did all of the same things, right? They all had arm articulation, they all built up their cores in similar ways, but by having characters of different heights, of different widths, like Onua, of different statures, etc., we were able to see something was changing here, and that's cool. A new torso mold in general for 2016 was a neat idea, even if ultimately I do think that the series kind of suffers for it, but that's, again, another topic. Ultimately, it sort of locked these characters into all using this torso, right? You can't have 5 characters use a torso and one use the old one, right? Because then, people get gypped out of that torso piece. And the torso it's more specialized a system than the gearbox from 2015. The gearbox in 2015 is used on sets that use a torso exclusively, but that's not to say you have to use it on sets that have torsos, right? You could use the gearbox for your own thing. However, the 2016 gearbox is the torso. You can't separate one from the other. I guess technically you could insert the leg piece of one into the blaster of the set from the year before. Ultimately, doesn't matter. With all of that being said, though, another thing that I think 2016 does poorly, outside of having sets that use different parts somehow coming out to look more of the same, right? On top of having sets that utilize more transparent colors and less of the primary colors of the characters that came before. And I think I understand why LEGO did this to help separate the Bionicle sets from Hero Factory, which came before, but I don't think Hero Factory is what was harming Bionicle sales. I think what was harming Bionicle sales was actually the introduction of another heavy hitter in the form of Star Wars. Star Wars CCBS sets came out in the second half of 2015 alongside the Skull villain sets, alongside the Star Wars movie, the reboot, I guess, of that series, right? And ultimately it was a movie that was quite successful. So you have now characters from this franchise that is topical, that is relatively well known as well. You have all of this. And you have these Skull villain sets, which feel like, for the most part, a step down from the previous wave. Couldn't even recolor like the Skull Basher mask in a set. No, you had to use that for what was it? San Diego Comic-Con or whatever. Like, that's silly stuff because it makes the sets, the waves, ultimately feel cheap. And it felt also, I want to say, inconsistent. I've used this word a lot to describe Bionicle Generation 2, ultimately, inconsistency. And I mean this in a lot of ways. There are a lot of little things about Generation 2 that ultimately make it feel more rushed than I think it should. I do think that the designers came into this with a passion for what they were doing, with a respect for the source material. But when you've got a set of characters that come with these gold masks that have this mask game but sort of go against, more collectible masks, right? You've introduced these gold masks in a way that's similar to Bionicle Generation 1. You're sort of biting off of the hand that also gave us the recolored masks, right? And how those worked in Generation 1 to actually give the Toa characters their gold masks. It's not to say you need to repeat that, don't get me wrong, but recolors of masks in Generation 1 Bionicle didn't exist solely to... Hold on, I actually do want to take this leather. Didn't exist solely to be things that the characters needed, but they existed also to be things that fans wanted, right? What do recolored masks do for Bionicle? First off, they facilitate and incentivize trading. And trading, I've talked about it plenty of times, is a form of word of mouth advertisement, right? When you go out of your way to trade with somebody else, you ask your friends, you ask your, members of another community you might have been a member of, hey, did you happen to buy any of these new Bionicle sets? And if so, did you happen to get this mask? And they go, oh, I didn't even know Bionicle was back. What? Like, what? It's little things like that. It might not amount to much, but I have to imagine that it would, ultimately, especially because it would help to drum up the conversation online as well. Not only is it word of mouth advertising, it's SEO advertising, right? People are searching for this Bionicle stuff. And I've talked about how I personally would have addressed mask packs because maybe Lego just didn't want to have extra products on store shelves, right? Because that's products that have to compete with other products they already have. They only have so much space on the store shelves. But I've talked about how these mask packs could have been actually utilized with the Protector sets, for example, because ultimately, well, I won't get into that. Again, I've already talked about it in previous videos. You can watch those if you'd like to. And you can also check out the Discord where I've talked about some of this stuff as well. That'll be linked down in the description. Let's get back to 2016 Bionicle. So one of the other things that I think kind of hurts 2016 Bionicle as well is the fact that we use this sort of crystal motif, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. I want to make that very clear. I am not the world's biggest fan of it, but just because I'm not the fan of X decision that Lego made does not make that decision bad. Lego does not exist to please me. It doesn't exist to please any one fan. It just has to hope that it makes more fans than it alienates. And the rocky texture of 2016, while it wasn't my favorite thing, especially at the time, it's something I've come around to a bit more as time has gone on. Ultimately, it ends up harming Bionicle, I think, in another way. Because it's not just the Toa Uniters that actually utilize this, but it's like so much of G2's second year of 2016 is just dominated by these rocky textures. Most of the new pieces that came out for 2016 had this crystalline texture, right? All of the Uniter masks, okay, that makes sense. You tie that into the story, you tie into the story that, the Uniter characters fell into a vat of, crystallized solution, whatever, do what you want with that. That's fine. I can get behind that. But then the creatures. Now, the creatures are not uniters. They are separate entities that exist along this world. You could still absolutely write into the story why the creatures also have and share a crystal texture with the uniters, right? Maybe they've bonded to these uniter characters, and so they take on their, aesthetic or something. Whatever. There are many... All right. There are many different ways that I think... Where's the other zombie? Oh, hi. There are many ways that I think ultimately you can help... Oh, for God's sake. All right, well, if there was iron around... Anyway, it's fine. All right, so getting back to what I was talking about. Ultimately, I think that with the Toa Uniter sets, the crystalline texture makes sense. Tie it into their transformation, whatever, fine, okay, I can get behind that. With the creatures, it makes less sense to me, but I can still understand it. Hell, I could even understand it with the beast sets to a degree. And I've even talked about something I would have done where, first off, I would have loved to have branched into even more supernatural type characters like the Skull villains. That's a separate topic, of course, so I'll talk about that in a different video. But with the Beast sets specifically, I thought it would have been really cool if this would tie back into the Toa's fight against the environment, so to speak, right? Obviously, these are still again, I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't want to branch into too many different topics in this video. At the end of the day, what this video is ultimately talking about is just my speculation as to why LEGO kind of failed Bionicle Generation 2. And I think part of it was just lack of devotion, if you will, to the theme. Again, I really believe that at the very least, the designers really wanted this to succeed. Wanted this project. I didn't mean to do that. Wanted this project to be a thing. But ultimately, that was not what we got, right? We got something that came out in 2015. I have to imagine it saw some pretty decent sales. I have no way to confirm that, though. But I think that each following wave saw less sales. I think that's my fear, right? Is that LEGO probably saw a drop in sales in the Skull wave. And part of that may have been attributed to the Star Wars sets having come out, having hit store shelves at the same time. Part of it, though, I'm sure was also just a lack of interest, right? The Skull villains didn't really do much to justify a separation, to even designate a separation between themselves and the master sets, right? And it's not to say that that's necessary, right? But when you look at something like Invasion from Below, for example, the machines and the beasts look distinctively different, and Bionicle followed that. So the fact that this couldn't really do something that simple while also having a theme that relied on far less parts, yeah, that's gonna lead to lower sales. I could see why that would be the case, but maybe there's a chance here or there, whatever, that LEGO does get more sales in 2016, more sales for their next wave. So they were probably hoping on these Uniters sort of sealing the deal for them. And they just didn't. I remember, as somebody who bought all of the Toa Master sets, as somebody who bought all of the Skull Villain sets, as somebody who bought all of the Toa Uniter sets, I remember those diminishing returns, those feelings of, well, this just, isn't as exciting to me as I had hoped it would be. The Master sets were great. I liked the Skull Villains, but I saw a little bit of quality dip, or I guess what would have felt like quality dip in that regard, right? These sets didn't go quite as far out of their way as I wanted. I saw the Lord of Skull Spiders and my disappointment in that, and then I saw the Skull Scorpio set and was like, it feels like LEGO learned nothing from their Skull Spider release. This was worse than Skull Spider, and there were plenty of completely justified critiques of that set. But then the Uniters come out, I still get them all, I build them all, and I'm still disappointed. Like, man, these aren't doing anything for me. The characters, arguably, in my opinion, looked a little worse. They were stylized, but they were stylized in a way that was a little more aggressive than the previous wave, which just felt, again, like a bit of an alienation of the theme because now the style has changed rapidly, too. But that's not always a bad thing, You could make the argument that the Toa Nuva look more aggressive than the Toa Mata, but they do so while changing few pieces as well. And it's also worth noting, too, that, yeah, I knew there was two of them, that the Toa Nuva don't all look more aggressive. Pohatu, rather, has a fairly aggressive-looking mask in his Mata form, and in his Nuva form, it's not aggressive at all. It's a really cool-looking mask, and I quite like it, even if I'm in the minority saying that. The Uniters, as I purchased them, did not scratch the itch that I ultimately wanted them to, and it relied on a function that was less exciting. It's also worth noting, too, that the function wasn't different between the sets, right? At the very least, with the Master sets using the gearbox, it meant that the gearbox could be incorporated in a few different ways. The Masters all did it the same way, don't get me wrong, but at the very least, they did one arm and two arms swinging, right? So you got a little bit of variation there. And then I am absolutely lost, I should mention. Doesn't matter. But the Uniters all have the same swinging upper torso. I understand that's part of the gimmick with the, creatures, the unification thing, whatever. Fine, okay. And then the Beast sets come out. This is 2016 Bionicle. I should be hyped. And I see them. I see there's even less new parts than there were with the Skull villain sets. And of those less new parts, several of them were identifiable from the previous wave. So I was like, what here is even like new? And now, I didn't know at the time when I saw them that this was the final wave. Lego obviously decided that probably, I don't know when, because I've never even seen like leaks of a 2017 potential line having been canned in the same way that I saw, the Star Wars sets, that the CCBS versions of those got canceled too in 2018. But we saw at least a couple leaks of sets that were promoted, but nothing for 2017 Bionicle. So I don't know exactly when Lego pulled the plug on this, but it had to have been pretty early. And so if that's the case too, it's almost like you're pushing a doomed project, Like, do you really expect people, how do I describe this? Ultimately, I don't think people are going to fall in love with a project you yourself cannot love. You know what I mean? And if Lego did not have faith in Bionicle, then they were going to sabotage Bionicle whether they meant to or not. And I don't think that this is a fault with Lego either. I think this is something that anybody would fall into. This is a trap that we all have a bias for, unfortunately, and we just have to recognize it. And I think that having Star Wars come out when Bionicle's second wave came out hurt the second wave a little bit. The second wave itself not really improving upon anything the first wave did hurt the second wave a little bit. And then the third wave following that really not improving on anything either hurt it further, right? Because the third wave didn't do anything to stand out, didn't do anything to be like, oh, you guys need to see this, right? It didn't do anything to promote that word of mouth advertisement, as I mentioned already. And I keep coming back to Inconsistency. This is the last time I want to mention it, and then I'm probably going to wrap this video up. Ultimately, I also talk generally, I know where I'm at now. I also talk generally about why I think that Bionicle's second wave, introducing the corrupt masks, only 4, which is dumb. It should have been a full set of 6, but whatever. The corrupt masks sets the precedent for gold and transparent being a corruption color scheme, right? It'd be like if the infected How from 2001 showed up in one of the Nuva masks, right? And then suddenly the infected Nuva mask is a completely different color, which technically does happen, but it happens for different reasons. Yes, I already know that there's a poisoned How. Point being, though, if Lego said, oh, the infected How in 2001 is a bad mask, but the infected looking How, this gunmetal and orange How Nuva or whatever, is actually a good guy mask, and oh, it's actually the mask that the character needs to power up. It's their new gold mask. Like, that's goofy, right? And so I keep doing that. Ultimately, I think that by having the Uniters chase masks that were dual molded in color, or marbled rather in color, I think that by having the creatures have masks that were marbled in color, beasts having masks that are marbled in color, like, you keep seeing this stuff and it's like, okay, you're giving us pieces that are rocky in texture, that are a little bit harder to use and paint us into a corner on what we can do with them. You're giving us masks that are rocky in texture and they're double colored. So now we're locked into not only using them with rocky textures, but also multiple different colors and like, etc. You see kind of where I'm getting at with this stuff? Anytime, it's not to say you can't do marbled parts. Taraga Duma in 2004 has a marbled mask, but it's reasonably easy to use, in part because it's one of only a few marbled masks from those early years. It's a significant mask as well, right? It's a character who plays this prominent story role, and also because one of those colors is a neutral, which it just helps. I hate to say it, but it's true. Having the mask be marbled with black is a very easy color to tie into other characters. Ultimately, I think that 2016 just didn't hit the grand slam that Bionicle needed. 2015 hit the home run, and 2016 was the team just saying, all right, we won this thing, so we don't need to even put any effort in, and just being blindsided by their own greed, And that's what it felt like at the end of the day. Lego kind of dropped the ball on that second wave. I don't think they meant to either. Like I said, I'm sure that they thought, man, this is going to go over really well. People are going to love this. It looks so cool. And you might like the aesthetic of the 2016 sets, but they're so vastly different from what came before, and yet so similar amongst themselves. You know? It's like, oh, well, great. Now all of my sets look homogenous and different from the characters I may have loved the first time around. The other thing that I've mentioned already about, I mean, hell, Lego should have learned, as an example, that too much metallic is probably a bad thing. 2008 Bionicle with the Mystica sets. Like, I don't know that many people that were like huge fans of the Mystica. And part of that, I think, is because of their heavy emphasis on metallic colors. Not solely, of course, but at least in part. They gave us great recolors, silver limb pieces. That's cool. Awesome, But like ultimately, the sets really suffered. That's my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Suffered for other reasons too, of course. All right. So anyway, that's pretty much all of the ramblings for this video. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe. It does help out the channel tremendously. I just think that these are some, not all by any means, of the reasons that G2 Bionicle ultimately failed. There are probably many internal reasons that the fan base will just never know. And I will also mention, just very briefly, that, I think that a Bionicle Generation 3, taking all of this into account, understanding the unique atmosphere that G2 existed in, understanding the unique atmosphere that G1 existed in, could potentially succeed. I think that it is the least risk for Lego if Lego does a system version of Bionicle, but it might be the least risk, but it's also probably the least likely to succeed because it would have to compete with other system themes, notably, once again, Star Wars, CCBS Mechs, Marvel, DC, Ninjago, Monkey Kid, etc. So many other mech type sets out there. Clearly, the popularity of mech sets means that there is an inkling for humanoid-esque walking bipedal figures, or at least Lego thinks there is. They're clearly working for Lego, right? So I think that in 2024, 25, 26, whatever the case may be, Bionicle, yes, needs to be a building system all its own. Whether it be a CCBS, a modified CCBS, its own thing entirely, what do I even call the system that was introduced in 2001 for original Bionicle? Like piston CCBS, like CCBS with greebling. I don't know what to call that. I don't think it has an official name. I know people call it construction, but they also call CBS construction. So ultimately, I think that a Bionicle series could succeed, but there's no guarantee. There is no promise. There's no holy grail. There's no, destined theme to come out of this. Lego has to get their butt into gear if they really want Bionicle to come back. And I've talked about how I think this could in part start with Bionicle reintroducing the McDonald's minifigures, only because that is actually very few pieces for Lego to remold, and it banks almost entirely on nostalgia. Nostalgia is a very powerful driver of sales, but it's also solid figures, that are easy to carry around, that are easy to, again, sort of spread by word of mouth, that have tradable parts that once again help to further spread the existence of these things by word of mouth. And it's also worth noting, before I end the video, that ultimately the McDonald's figures, there's no stakes in them, right? There's no story. I mean, you could add a story for sure, and I think you should, but they're not weighed down by the burdens of any previous series. If you go with something as simple, it's like the custom minifigure series, or collectible minifigure series. There aren't stories that go with those characters. Sometimes there are characters derived from stories that find their ways into the collectible minifigure series, in much the same way as Bionicle characters would, but on their own, there's no story that goes with them. It's for you to make up, and so they're not burdened by a story. Lego kind of failed G2 in that regard. I hate to say it. G1's story got really complicated, and they needed to address it. That's correct, but G2's way of addressing it was just don't even have a compelling story. Don't have a compelling story. Don't have implements in the story that have like names in this fantasy world. Don't call the Toa Toa anymore. Don't call the Turaga Turaga anymore. Just like, and that doesn't simplify the story. It makes it feel like you think the audience is idiots. You know what I mean? Like, oh, this silly audience, they can't remember the name of these characters anyway. Like, that's just what it feels like to me. For a newcomer, no, they don't have the context of those sets, so like it wouldn't alienate them, but it would alienate older fans, right? Like, does that make sense? Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, that's it for this one. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe. It helps out the channel tremendously. Hopefully you've enjoyed this content, and if you enjoy me talking and rambling about Bionicle while playing Minecraft or another game or whatever, like, let me know that in the comments too. This is just trying something different. And again, you can check out the Discord to continue the conversation further, but let me know your thoughts in the comments specifically about G2, why you think it failed, G3, if you think there is, or rather, let me plant the little seed of conversation here by saying, rather than talking about if G3 could happen, let's say you were put in control of kicking off Bionicle G3. What would you do to kick off the theme? All right, I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.